Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Way T Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. Glad for you to join us today. We are excited and delighted because we have a world-class expert today, Dr. Evan Hirsch, who is a world-renowned fatigue expert and is the founder and CEO of the International Center for Fatigue. There's a lot of people with fatigue. He suffered with fatigue for 5 years before he achieved resolution using the Fix Your Fatigue program. We're going to talk about that in a second. And he pioneered this in his medical practice through his best-selling books, podcasts, and online programs. He has helped thousands of people around the world optimize their energy naturally. And he is on a mission to help a million more. You might be one of them or someone you know. He also helps licensed functional medicine providers transition to a successful virtual practice. That's really a big deal in a COVID world, so that they can have more impact, more success, and a greater quality of life. He is board certified, is in integrative medicine. And this is a really expanding and important field we can probably talk about here. And when he's not in the office, you can find him singing musicals, dancing, and playing basketball with his family. Dr. Hirsch, welcome to the podcast.
Wait, that was quite an intro. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, hey, fatigue is a big thing, and probably I would say it's probably, if not the number one, certainly in the top three things that people end up going to a functional medicine doctor for. Mm-hmm. I would like, before we get into all your background and everything, or how you get it, I guess how you get this fatigue thing, can you explain to people what the difference between a functional medicine doctor and, say, your regular GP, and why that's so important, especially today?
It's a great question. And, I am an MD, a medical doctor. So I did go through that conventional system. And what I learned in that system, a lot of good things, were kind of how to diagnose something and then how to treat it using pharmaceuticals. So you really don't look at things as a cause if you don't have a pharmaceutical to treat it. And so this is conventional medicine. Oftentimes also, you're covering up symptoms, and the symptoms may get better, but you're not necessarily getting at the actual cause. So if we take, for example, high blood pressure. If somebody has high blood pressure, you can take prescription medications and they can lower your blood pressure, which is great. But the idea around functional medicine is actually looking at the cause underneath that. So what is actually causing your high blood pressure? Is it heavy metals? Is it a magnesium deficiency? Is it stress? Whatever it is, we figure out what it is, because it's going to be different for different people. Figure out what it is, fix that problem, and then you don't need those prescriptions, which also have a lot of side effects. The number 3 killer in this country is side effects from medications, from prescriptions. And so the less prescriptions that we can take, the better. And so we just need to keep asking the question, what is the why? What is the cause? What is the why of the why of the why? Like the cause of the cause of the cause, so that we can really get down to the root cause. And that's really what functional medicine is looking at. It's looking at that root cause, different areas of imbalance in the body, and the biochemical individuality. So what your cells are saying versus what my cells are saying, and when they're off, how do we fix them?
I'm curious, as a medical practitioner who's gone through the medical model, and as it says I believe in the New England Journal of Medicine, is we do not treat or cure illnesses, we treat the symptoms of disease. And I think that's a very big component. And we have a world, particularly in the United States or North America, where we go to our doctors and we think that's healthcare, but it's more like essentially disease or symptom management as opposed to healthcare. Healthcare to me is something preventative or looking into, like you said, the causes. At what point in your training did you realize that you wanted to kind of take that next step, which is far more complicated than just saying, hey, you've got these symptoms, let's give you this drug, it would seem that your methodology is much more inclusive and probably a little bit more difficult than that model. Would you agree with that?
I would. And for me, it actually happened quite early. So I was in my, was it my first or second year of medical school? I think it was my first year. And I was asking a lot of why questions.
Right.
Because I'm naturally very curious. And I wasn't getting the answers that I wanted. And I actually had a pathology professor who became a very good friend of mine. We actually sang in a group together called Docapella when we were in medical school. And he actually exposed me to hypnotherapy, gave me some books to read about Native American healing. And my first training that I did while I was still in medical school that was more alternative was a hypnotherapy training. And then from there, I met somebody who said, hey, you should join us at the American Holistic Medical Association. I'd never heard of it before, but then I went and my mind was blown about how to treat people more naturally using vitamins, minerals, herbs, all that.
This is awesome. And so I guess when a lot of people go to their traditional medical doctors and they go through the run of the mill, which, and I'm not here to throw medical doctors under the bus. They're very motivated, intelligent people who work really hard and are confined to a very narrow toolbox, I would say, given their intellectual capability and their training, you know, and also severe time constraints.
Right.
What would you suggest to someone who might be struggling with some conditions like fatigue, which is a big one? It's a huge one. It's a really big problem. And they're not getting anywhere with their GP. The GP is telling them, well, it's in your head, or, you know, we can't really do anything about it, or, you know, maybe eat a better diet or get some more, you know, it's kind of like these kind of cliche statements. And then they run a bunch of tests and, you know, the person sends in this mill for a lot of years. And they say, okay, they walk into your door. They've finally given up on that model and come into your door. What's that conversation like? And how does that ensue based on how their care was before and then how you would approach that?
Yeah, so unfortunately, way too many people have medical trauma in this country and around the world, where the conventional model has shamed people into believing that there's something wrong with them. And there's nothing wrong with them. You know, the question is not, what are you doing? The question is, what happened to you? Right? Because all this stuff, you know, this is not the individual's fault. Like, they're not at fault for what happened to them. There are things that ended up happening along the way, stressors, whether they're mental or emotional, physical, like some of the toxins we're going to talk about today, that end up building up in the body that end up leading to fatigue. Now, just because a doctor did not have the right test to determine whether or not you have a cause, or didn't have the right knowledge to determine whether or not you have a particular cause, doesn't mean that you don't have that cause. And the thing is that this is not just conventional docs. Unfortunately, this is also natural docs and even some integrative and functional medicine docs where they say, you know, I can't help you. And if a doc says that, it generally means that they're not being curious enough, or they're not expanding their differential. They're not looking for what else it could be. Because if you continue to expand that and you're not having success with what you're doing, you're going to continue to look for what else it could be. Because that's how we learn. You know, I used to get people better to a certain point, and there were people that I couldn't help. And I was like, okay, well, why can't I help these people? Let me go learn. And then I was able to help more people. And there was people that I couldn't help. And I was like, okay, well, let me go learn. So that you create this really big differential of all of the potential causes that it could be, so you can make sure that you're not missing anything. And that's what we do at that first appointment, is that the journey begins with step one, which is determining what causes an individual has, because everybody has multiple causes when it comes to fatigue. There's these 10 categories of causes, and everybody has something from every single one of those categories, and everybody has something different than their neighbor, which is why it becomes so complicated. So you can't just take one thing and think it's going to fix this problem where you've got all these different causes.
You know, that's a great I would call wide scope accounting approach, and understanding what the potential causes are, and then also being able to go through systematically and test for those things, that so you can make lifestyle alterations, or um, some sort of way of removing that obstacle towards health and vitality. I think of recently, I was at a Tony Robbins event a couple years ago, and he ran into some major health issues because of high levels of mercury. In fact,
Right.
I think he's got one of the highest recorded levels of mercury in the history of the planet. I couldn't even believe he was alive. And he's spent the last few years going through extensive detoxification of mercury from his body, which has been very difficult for him and very hard, and has had compromised him on many occasions, but he's just, went through it. Had he not gone to individuals outside the people that couldn't help him with this condition, he might not be with us today, and his contribution would be taken from the world. How do you, when someone comes in with, let's deal with fatigue particular, because I know that's your big wheelhouse. You've written a book on it and stuff. Can you talk about, if someone has fatigue, how do you approach it? How do you go through this list? What are the kind of tests are you running? How does someone where does someone start with this when they're just feeling, I'm so tired. I don't have that energy. I don't feel like I used to. Something's not right. And everyone's like, oh, it's in your head. You're getting old. All those kind of cliche things.
So the first thing that people need to do is they need to realize that there's a problem, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, I'm just getting older. They go to their conventional doc. It's too much work to keep searching, right? I'm going to go to another doc, and then I'm going to go to this alternative doc, or, how do I know that I'm going to find what I need? And it's just too much work. I'm just going to change my life. I'm going to slow things down, and maybe that'll work for people. But if you're like you and I, where you're a professional, you've got big goals, that's not going to work for you. And you need to figure out what's wrong. So the first thing is realizing there's a problem. If you're surviving on caffeine, if your energy is crashing throughout the day, if after lunch you want to crawl under the desk and take a nap, if on the weekends it's just about recovery and you can't really go out and do what you want to do, then there's a problem. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is figuring out what the cause, because whether it's an HR problem at work, or whether it's a problem with your car, like your gas pipe or whatever it is, you need to figure out what the cause is in order to fix it, right? So that's really the mission that people should be going on, is figuring out what the cause, or in fatigue's case, what the causes are, because it's never just one thing. People think, oh, I was fine until that moment in time when all of a sudden I had a car accident, or this person broke up with me, or whatever, or I kissed somebody, or whatever, got COVID, and then all of a sudden I'm laid out. And it's actually, that was the straw. Right. But it's this buildup over time. So that's the first thing that we do in step one, is determine the causes that people have. Now, interestingly, 75% of the causes can be determined by symptoms alone, which is super cool, because people can join our programs. They can go through that step one workbook, and at the end of an hour or so, they're going to know 75% of their causes, which means they can start taking supplements that are specific to those causes. And then they can spend their money on the 25% of those causes that really need the labs.
So what are some of the causes of fatigue overall?
So let's jump into that. So we talked about these 10 categories of fatigue, and those can really be divided up into deficiencies. So things that are not in the body that are supposed to be, and then toxicities. So things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there. So if we look at the deficiencies,
that's the two major categories, right? I'm missing something that I need, or I have something in my body that I shouldn't have.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And so those deficient, and what's interesting too, is that the toxicities actually cause 90% of the deficiencies.
Correct. Yeah, that's an interesting component, especially with the modern food additives and components and all the chemical agents that have been added ad nauseum, expanding daily. And very little research going into, or very little public information about the long-term consequences, as well as the buildup factor of these things. Like a little bit, okay, it doesn't harm you, but
Right.
how many pesticides do I need to eat over 20 to 30 years before it messes me up? You know, I don't know, right? There's an old thing with at one time, the whole thing of mad as a hatter
Right.
was a terminology, but they used mercury on the hats.
Right.
Now, a little bit of mercury probably wouldn't hurt that, but you're doing with mercury every day, you go mental.
Right.
So,
That's a really good point. Yeah.
it's kind of an extreme example, but I think it's fair to say that that happens for a lot of people just living in the modern world.
Absolutely. Yeah. So those toxicities are causing most of those deficiencies. So you would think that we could go right at those toxicities, but actually that's step 4. We can't go right at the toxicities because we have to start by replacing the deficiencies, and then we'll talk about step 3 and step 4 too. But can we go into the specific causes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So when we look at those deficiencies, we're looking at deficiencies of hormones. So the adrenal gland is a little triangular gland, sits on top of the kidneys, produces cortisol as well as other stress hormones, and regulates a whole bunch of amazing things, including your ability to get out of bed in the morning, those crashes that are happening between 2 and 4 p.m., those cravings that you have for salty and sweet food, the sleep problems you're having, the regulation of your blood sugars, a whole bunch of stuff. And so that's important. There's deficiencies in thyroid and sex hormones. There's deficiencies in nutrients like vitamins and minerals. There are deficiencies in neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, things that affect the mood. And then there's deficiencies in lifestyle habits. So not enough water, not enough good food, not enough sleep, and not enough movement. And then, of course, there's deficiencies or dysfunction in mitochondria, which produces about 70 to 80% of our energy and gets squashed by all of these toxicities that we're going to talk about in a second. So those are all the deficiencies that actually have to get boosted in order to be successful at removing the toxicities, because removing the toxicities is actually stressful on the body. So we have to be as resilient as possible. So we work on our mindset during this process, and we've got a process for doing that. And then we're also boosting all of these deficiencies to make you as robust as possible. And then we go into step 3, which is to open up the detoxification pathways. Because in step 4, when we reach to our tissues and kind of pull these toxins out into the bloodstream, we want to make sure that there's a pathway for those toxins to be able to get out of the body. So in step 3, we're opening up these detox pathways. And this is the reason why a lot of people feel worse when they're going through detoxification, because they haven't done step 3 appropriately. They haven't opened up the bowels so that people are having 2 good bowel movements a day. They haven't opened up the liver and the kidney, these amazing filters that are so important. They haven't opened up the lymph, which is the garbage system in the body, or the neural lymph, which is the lymph system in the brain, because you got to be able to dump from one system into the next, into the next, into the next in order to get it actually out of the body. So I think of these systems as like tubes where they're clogged right now when people have fatigue, because everybody who's got fatigue actually has these clogged tubes. And so you have to open up those pathways in order to be able to grab something to put it into that tube so it can actually clear itself as well.
Very, very, I love the structure. It's great.
Yeah, so that's step 3. And then step 4 is going into the toxicity. So it's the heavy metals that you talked about. Over 100,000 pounds of mercury have been dumped into our oceans every year. The issue that Tony Robbins had was because he was on a swordfish diet. The bigger the fish, the more the mercury, because it's stored in fat. So we're talking about swordfish and halibut and tuna. You know, Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, no longer recommends tuna fish for pregnant women. It used to be, I remember when I was going through residency, it was like a couple of cans a week is okay. And then it went to a couple of cans a month. And then it went to 1 can a month. And then it went to none, because mercury is a neurotoxin and they were finding just very large amounts in fish.
Very common in the bodybuilding world, which I had a background in, for older bodybuilders to run into neurological conditions And I can think of some former national champions that I knew that had high levels of mercury toxicity because these people have been eating a couple cans of tuna every day for decades.
Right. That's so interesting. So yeah, so heavy metals like mercury, and then 70% of lipsticks have lead in them. And there's a lot of other exposures that we have. There used to be leaded gasoline, obviously
Yes.
leaded paint in many of our homes. And then with chemicals, chemical toxicity, 84,000 different chemicals we're exposed to on a regular basis. And most of those haven't been appropriately studied, like you talked about. And those are things like pesticides and herbicides and insecticides and plastics that we're exposed to on a regular basis. You know, part of my story was that I had pretty much all of these causes. I used to drive across country. I've driven across country 6 different times, taken different routes, loved it. But I always had a water bottle next to me that was being cooked in the sun. And I was just, you know, drinking out of it all day long. Right. And so that's how I got a lot of the plastics in my body. And then just growing up without the knowledge about organics, a lot of pesticides and herbicides as well.
Quick
And I
question
grew,
on the
go ahead.
plastics. Quick question on the plastics, because
Oh,
this is becoming a growing pattern I'm seeing in some of the testing data that we're finding is people having high levels of plastics literally inside their tissues. Do you have any hacks on removing plastic from the body?
absolutely. So one of the things that I love to do, or something that, you know, I don't know everybody who's in your audience right now, but I would say saunas are really amazing for getting rid of a lot of toxins. Um, and they can get rid of a number of different toxins. They're usually not going to get rid of everything, but that's one thing that you can do right now is to get yourself a good far infrared sauna. I do have some of those on my recommended page if people are interested in what I recommend. There's also certain binders that people can take, like charcoal or flaxseed, different fibers, pectosol, or like modified citrus pectin. There's a number of these, and there's some combination products that I like to use. And then there's things like N-acetylcysteine or glutathione, which are the body's main antioxidant and detoxifiers. So those are some of my favorite ones that I like to use. There's some natural ones like cilantro and chlorella, cayenne. There's a number of different products that I like to use, in combination products especially. But those are just some of the ways where you can start getting, because it's all about getting layers off of the human system. Because if we think about it, all the stuff that we've been building up over time, you can think about the body like a barrel, like a large rain barrel, where over time we've been accumulating crap. And it's only when it starts to spill over, all this crap starts to spill over, that we actually start getting symptoms. And so we have to start bailing this crap out of the body, but we also have to poke a hole in the bottom and allow it to drain out. So these are just some of the ways to do it.
Okay, that's great. Sorry, I interjected in your whole series because I think we got to number 4. There was number 5, right?
No, it was great. Yeah. So heavy metals, chemicals, molds. Molds are incredibly insidious. So half of all first world buildings have water damage, and most of those have mold. So it's a huge problem. And most people don't believe that they have any mold because they've never seen any mold in their homes. But they also forget that maybe the home that they grew up in had a flood in the basement, or maybe there was a leak in the roof, or maybe there was a busted pipe. Right? So it can be any of those things in any home that you ever lived in, even if that home was when you were 5 years old. Because like I said before, it's this accumulation over time. So let's say you were like me, where I grew up eating tuna fish sandwiches and had mercury fillings, whole bunch of mercury. And then I lived in a moldy place when I was in medical school, right? And then I was exposed to those chemicals that I talked about, or in gross anatomy, I had formaldehyde poisoning, which I didn't know of at the time. So it's this accumulation, but I didn't have fatigue until my 30s, right? So it's just, but when I tested, yeah, I had tons of mold from the place that I lived in when I was in medical school.
One of my mentors, Dr. David Carmos, who was a disciple of Paul Bragg, with the Essenes, was in a Mexican prison for 5 years, coming back he was bringing acupuncture gear from Brazil, and they said that he was carrying contraband drugs, and he spent 5 years in a Mexican prison, wrote 12 books and prose, mind you, and treated 17,000 people and taught 100 different doctors his methodologies while he was in there. Mexican prisons are a little different than ours. And he was taken out with cancer, and he felt it was the level of mold that he was exposed to, and he wasn't able to detox fast enough when he was in his 70s, and wasn't able to recover from that, unfortunately. So I think mold is one of these really insidious things that really can cause problems. What are some of the symptoms people experience with mold in particular? Because it's so widespread and very few GPs will even mention it.
Oh yeah, pretty much none. You know, they're not trained on it. I wasn't trained on it in medical school. And a lot of that, once again, comes from if you can't test for it, or you don't have a test, or you don't believe in the test, and you don't have a prescription for it, it's not something that you're going to treat.
Right.
So the symptoms generally, they present as fungal symptoms. So oftentimes there's rashes, there's itching, oftentimes itchy anus, itchy ears are common symptoms. There's worsening symptoms after eating sugar, and usually the worsening symptoms are brain fog. And oftentimes there's pretty bad brain fog. And so that just means foggy thinking, not able to remember words, you know, walking into a room and forgetting why you were there. But those are the most common symptoms that I would say. There can also be neuropathies. There can be like weird shooting pains in the body, pain in the bottom of the feet sometimes. So it's mainly weird symptoms that can't be explained. Now, you can also get weird symptoms that can't be explained from heavy metals, chemicals, as well as infections. And so this is why when we talk about those 25% that you really need lab testing for, it's heavy metals and chemicals and molds. And actually with mold, there's two tests that are needed. There's a test to determine whether or not you're living in mold, because if you're living in mold, you're not going to get better. You have to remediate the place that you're living in, or you have to find a new place. It's not that hard to remediate, so don't get overwhelmed by that thought. But you have to do a test to determine whether or not you're living in mold. And then you have to see if there's mold in your body. Because if you have mold in your body, but you don't have mold in your home, that means that the mold in your body came from a different home or a different place that you worked or whatever. You don't have to remediate the home. So it's kind of, that's part of the sleuthing that has to happen to determine, you know, what to do next.
And how do you test for mold?
So the best test is a urine mycotoxin test.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So mycotoxins are toxins produced by the molds and that live in different parts of the body. Now, the urine test really is the best way to determine, and there's really no false positives on this. If you find that you have urine mycotoxins or mycotoxins in your urine, there's really nothing else that's going to be causing that. It's not like some mold testing that's done in the blood where you're looking at indirect markers, where you're looking at how the immune system is responding to mold. It's not the best test. Best test is going to be actually to see the mold in your body in the form of these mycotoxins coming out in the urine.
Got it. Okay. So let's say someone comes into your practice, they're tired, fatigued. You've recognized they got some nutritional deficiencies. They go, you bolster up that sort of stuff. You suggest, hey, we get you kind of back on track. We've got to now then detoxify. What kind of time frames are we looking at for people in order to do this? Because I think with a lot of people, we're trained on this, hey, I got a problem, take a pill, it goes away. Where if you've got something that's been a contributing factor for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 50 years, whatever it happens to be, I would suspect that your process takes a little bit longer. What have you found typically for people to address fatigue, assuming they're motivated and assuming that they are doing what you recommend, because compliance is another big issue.
The Bioptimizer mission is to help more of the world fix their digestion at a core level. The truth is, your digestion is only as good as your enzyme levels. Imagine trying to build a house with a tree. It's impossible. You need to chop the tree down into small pieces. Similarly, in order for your food to be used by your body, it must be broken down into a bioavailable form. And that's what enzymes do, converting protein into amino acids, fats into specific fatty acids, and carbohydrates into usable energy units. We start out with an abundance of enzymes, and that's why kids can digest just about anything really quickly. The thing is cooking food kills enzymes as they cannot survive at temperatures above 118 degrees. So years of this ends up depleting our bodies and leads to weak digestion. Taking digestive enzymes like masszymes, which has an incredibly high level of protease for digesting protein, as well as other critical enzymes like lipase, amylase, and others is a total game changer. Suddenly you strengthen your digestion, eliminate gas and bloating, boost metabolism, and multiply your energy. Most importantly, you fix your digestion at a core level. To get started with Masszymes and to save 10% on your first order, go to masszymes.com. That's MASSZYMES.com and use the code MASS10, MASS10.
So it generally will take 6 to 24 months, depending on the number of causes that somebody has and the severity of those causes. And then also if they're living in a moldy environment.
Right.
So our program that we offer is 6 months, and then people can continue with us if they want to, if they need that additional support. But after that 6 months, they've found the causes that they have, and then it's just about removing them. And that's kind of where that variability comes into play. But most of the people that we see, I mean, yes, there are some people who aren't that compliant, but most of the people we see are to the point where they're like, I understand, they see the success stories that we've had. They're like, just tell me what the protocol is. I'm going to implement it. You know, they're kind of at their wits' end, you know, and so we don't see that much of an issue unless for some reason they're not able to tolerate supplements or they can't get out of a moldy environment or whatever it is. So there's always some of those other nuances, but you're absolutely right. There is a variability, and it really depends on the severity that they have and the number of causes that they have. And we didn't finish with toxicity, so I'd love to jump back into that whenever you want.
Please, let's go back there. My bad. I got ahead of the bus here.
No, I paused. But yeah, we talked about heavy metals, chemicals, molds, and just to tell people where we're going, infections, allergies, negative emotional patterns, and electromagnetic fields. Those are the other toxicities that we're going to talk about.
Right.
And
Let's
so
get into infections right away. I think that's one that I think people think of an infection. I got something as a cut and I'm infected, but infections is a lot deeper than that.
Absolutely. We're talking about chronic infections. So the CDC, Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, a couple of years ago, had a statement that there are 30,000 new cases of Lyme disease per year in the United States. Now that number is 476,000 that they have agreed to. So, right, and so there's here in the United States, new cases,
and that's not accounting how many people have got it and don't even know about it.
Exactly, and it doesn't include the co-infections as well. So Lyme is Borrelia, but it doesn't include things like Bartonella or Babesia or Anaplasma or Ehrlichia or Epstein-Barr virus or now COVID. You know, we've got long COVID or long haulers now that we're seeing that we've incorporated into our program to help those people. So there are a lot of these chronic infections that get into the body, and oftentimes they've been with you for a long time, but they're not a problem until you get a number of those stressors, a number of those things where all of a sudden the immune system's hijacked off into left field because you have heavy metals, chemicals, and molds, and then the infections come out and they become opportunistic.
Right.
They're taking advantage. What's that?
Death by 1,000 cuts.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's important to remember that, you know, we are 90% in this human form, we're 90% bug cells and 10% human cells. So we normally have this beautiful symbiosis that ends up happening. You guys have these great probiotics, that help to rebalance that, right? And so it's one of those huge problems that I see. Mold and chronic infections are a lot of those things that other doctors don't want to touch. And that so many of these people who've got chronic fatigue or myalgic encephalitis, which is what they call it in the UK and beyond, have. They've got generally a combination of those two, and it hasn't been found, and it needs to be. So
why
just go ahead.
Want to deal with that, just as a curiosity? What is it? Just because it's too complex, too long to deal with? Like, what is the obstacle there?
I think it's both, because it's not just conventional docs. It's natural, integrative, and functional medicine docs who are like, I take care of this stuff. Yeah. And that's too complex for me, which is fine. It's good to know, where you're at, but you also have to know when to refer.
Right.
Because a lot of people they continue to try things which aren't necessarily working, or they think, oh, we just need to tweak this a little bit, and then we're going to, like going after the gut. Gut is incredibly important. It has to be fixed. But if you're spending all of your time fixing the gut and you're not focusing on molds, heavy metals, chemicals, infections, like you're not going to get the person better if they have those things. So it's just kind of next level thinking but it is complex, and dealing with mold and helping people navigate mold remediations and whatnot can be very complicated. That's why we have a health coach on staff who has done this numerous times. She is a mold remediation coach, and she's excellent at it, so that we can hold people's hands and kind of help them through the process.
And if people want to refer out to some other authorities in the industry to hear their own challenges with it, Tim Ferriss does an extensive podcast on his exposure to Lyme disease and how difficult that was for him, who's extremely well resourced. Dave Asprey talks about the sufferings from mold and what he had to do to overcome that in his life. And these are, like you said, 500,000 people being diagnosed with Lyme's disease in America alone. That's a big chunk of the population.
Right.
It's far more insidious than what we're currently mitigating for in a lot of in reality. What are some other things that we didn't touch on here in your list? Because then I want to get into your book and your process.
Absolutely. And I'm just one more quick thing on the infections. So oftentimes these infections will present with symptoms that are misdiagnosed with other things. So for example, there's something called plantar fasciitis, which is pain on the bottom of the foot. And this oftentimes is Bartonella, which is one of those co-infections that you can get from your pet. So upwards of 50% of all domestic animals, cats and dogs, they lick you in the face, you've got Bartonella. You can also get it from mom through the placenta. You can get it from ticks and mosquitoes and all this sort of stuff. But you can get pain on the bottom of the foot. You can get muscle cramps. You can get thyroid issues. You can get problems sleeping, anxiety, depression, muscle pain, usually misdiagnosed as fibromyalgia, headaches, migraines. So that's just Bartonella. With Babesia, these people have spontaneous sweating. They're usually the hottest person in the room. They're always asking for the AC to be turned up. Oftentimes they've got chronic coughs, and then they've got really bad sleep, anxiety to the point of panic attacks, depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. And COVID is actually showing us it's been disrupting a lot of the microbiome. So it's kind of bringing some of these bugs to the surface. So we'll see where people will have COVID, they'll get these symptoms, and you start treating these symptoms as these bugs, and then those symptoms go away. So we're seeing that there's some sort of relationship here where COVID is disrupting the biofilm, this hiding place of these bugs, allowing these bugs to come out, cause problems that have to be addressed. So that's just like a quick aside, so that people need to pay attention to any sort of weird symptom that you have. You have to think about mold, chronic infections, and then secondarily, chemicals and heavy metals.
I love this. Is so thorough. This is a lot of fun. So let's talk about your book, why you wrote it, who it's for, and why people need to read this book specifically if they or someone they know is suffering from fatigue. Because I think this is really important to realize. There's so much stigma around someone who is suffering from fatigue, that they're lazy, they're unmotivated, they're a hypochondriac, there's a whole laundry list of kind of negative projections or associations or labels that go on people who are really suffering from fatigue. And they may not be finding relief in their conventional areas. And probably a lot of people listening to this has someone in their life that's suffering from some form of fatigue that seems debilitating. So talk to me about the book and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so the book is called Fix Your Fatigue, and it takes people through the 4-step process. I'm actually going to be updating it recently because I wrote the book back in 2017 and I've made a number of updates to the protocol. But it goes into my story. I had fatigue for 5 years, just about destroyed my business, my relationships, my relationship with my wife, my relationship with my daughter. It was not a pretty scene. And so I don't want anybody to suffer with what I had to suffer with. And that's why I'm on a mission to help 1 million people resolve their fatigue. So I take people through the process that I use with people in my one-on-one and my group programs, and give them a taste of what it's like to work with us, and then also to see which causes they have. And we've got a summit coming up that I'm doing with Dr. Tom O'Brien in mid-June, June 14th, where we're doing the Fatigue and Autoimmunity Summit, looking at hidden causes, where we're going to actually take people through the process of figuring out 75% of their causes based off of their symptoms. So every single day, I'm going to be in the Facebook group helping people determine what these causes are. And then you're going to have 40 amazing lectures to go with it to help them understand and kind of flesh out all that around each one of these causes.
Well, we've had Tom on the podcast, and he has a wealth of knowledge such as yourself, and I think that's so great. We'll make some show notes in here so people can get access to this and watch this. I think that's really, really important, especially considering you're a doctor. I just as a caveat, just to make sure I'm clear about this for our listeners, how do you maybe rate or diagnose fatigue? And is it a scale? How does a person know I'm suffering from fatigue?
Yeah, good question. And I would clarify first that I actually don't diagnose or treat anymore, because I operate as a health coach. In order to be able to help people across state lines, nationally and internationally, about 1/3 of all of our participants are actually international now. And so in order to be able to do that, I operate as a health coach. And fortunately, I can do that because everything that I do is natural. So I educate and I make recommendations, and it works really well. What's funny is that people see me do that and they say, well, don't you feel bad about leaving your MD? And I tell them, I said, if the end justifies the means, if I'm going to help 1 million people resolve their fatigue, it doesn't matter what the initials are after my name, right? I have to figure out how to do that, how to help people on a broader scale. But to answer your question, people, in terms of deciding whether or not they have fatigue, it really depends on the symptoms that they're having. So if they're surviving on caffeine, if their energy is crashing throughout the day, 2 p.m. is a really big time, between 2 and 4 p.m. If they're not sleeping well, if they're waking up and they feel like they're hungover, these are all signs that there's a problem and they have to pay attention. And so then we go into kind of like, what level problem do they have? Well, if they have a level 1 problem, this means that they can fix their fatigue with lifestyle habits. So they start drinking more water, they start eating better food, getting off of the standard American diet, they start sleeping more, they start moving more, and their fatigue goes away. That's great. That's a level 1 problem. If they still have fatigue, then they have a level 2 or a level 3 problem. Now, a level 2 problem is fatigue that goes away when you replace the deficiencies in step 2. So you're taking your adrenals and your thyroid and your mitochondria and your B12 and whatever else you're taking, in addition to fixing your lifestyle habits. And if fatigue goes away, that's considered a level 2 problem. And then level 3 is if they have a toxicity. So if they still have fatigue, and this is where we see most people, because a lot of people that we see have seen conventional, natural, integrative, functional medicine providers, and they're still tired.
Mm-hmm.
So it's generally a toxicity or a deficiency that's been missed that needs to be fixed.
Love it. And so I guess you're probably going through some of this inside the book of how to kind of systematically go through this. And is that what the book is, or what else is in your book? Because I haven't yet had an opportunity to read it yet.
Yeah, so I'll have to send it to you. So it's, it takes people through the symptoms, it looks at the labs, it looks at how to interpret the labs, so that they can get an idea just based off of what they get. Then they can actually go to their practitioner and ask them to run certain labs, or they can get them from a lab store that doesn't require a prescription. So there's a number of different things in there. And then I talk about some of the treatments that are recommended. But what's important to remember is that it really is, my editor called it my magnum opus. I dumped all of my good stuff. It's like my great work. But what's important to remember is that you really want to do this with a team. If you resonate with what I'm saying, you want to choose me as a mentor or somebody else as a mentor if you resonate with what they say when it comes to a certain condition. And then you want to go through a process that includes support along the way. Because if you have questions, which you're going to have questions, you need to be able to ask questions every day. You need to be able to get face-to-face time every couple of weeks with your mentor. You need to be able to have a community that will support you along the way. And so we've incorporated all of those things into our program so that it can help people get the results that they want. Because the book is great, and there are people who get good results with the book, but it takes so much more dedication, and it's a lot harder because you don't have those other components that I mentioned.
What are the biggest challenges for somebody who's maybe got to the point where they're seeing you and they want to engage with this? What do you see is the major blockages or challenges to overcome for people to kind of eliminating fatigue forever? Is it, time, energy, money, belief? What are those things that are tripping people up on this journey?
Yeah, it's all of them. So let's talk first about energy. So one of the reasons also why we have step 2 where it is because the big 3, as I call it, which is the adrenals, the thyroid, and the mitochondria, gives people the biggest boost of energy. So I actually don't even talk about lifestyle habits until they've done that, because you're not going to have the energy or the will to change your diet, to go to sleep earlier, to do a whole bunch of other things that require a lot of work until you have more energy. So that's the big thing, is that you have to have more energy in order to work on your energy. So that's the big 3 is just such an important part of that process. The other thing is beliefs. So one of the first things that we do is we start talking about mindset. And we talk about gratitude. And there's research behind all this. Gratitudes, 3 gratitudes a day. We talk about visioning. We talk about looking at your limiting beliefs and flipping them on their head and creating empowering beliefs. We look at your disempowering question and look at your empowering question and create a new empowering question, which is something I learned from Tony Robbins. So it's this process that's so important for neuroplasticity, for changing the way that you're thinking so that you can live from a positive state and be grateful for where you are, and then also know that you want to move ahead. That is one of the most challenging things. But having gratitude in the moment ends up rewiring the brain. And we also have a nervous system retraining coach on staff. We have weekly meditations in order to do all this stuff in addition to the mindset, so that we can retrain the brain, because it's such a huge component of this. Brain and emotions are just as big as all of this physical medicine stuff.
I love the fact that you come from a medical background and you're speaking terminology, which I like, which some people would associate with woo or pseudoscience. But here you are, you have a track record for dealing with people who really have been in a hopeless situation, being paralyzed by fatigue and disrupting their quality of life. Is there any areas that we haven't covered in regards to fixing your fatigue?
Let's see. Well, just real quick on the toxicities, just a reminder for folks, heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies. So this can be food allergies or inhaled allergies, negative emotional patterns. This is why we do the mindset, why we do the nervous system retraining. And this can be what's called ACEs, or adverse childhood events, or adverse life events, where it doesn't have to be abuse as we classically know it as, like physical abuse, emotional abuse, mental abuse, or sexual abuse. It can be rejection of a peer group, from a peer group, or something that is less than nurturing. So I was rejected by a peer group when I was 10, cried my eyes out, and changed the way that I saw friendship and other humans as being safe. That ended up increasing my stress, and something that I've had to work on over the years. So that's the negative emotional patterns. And then the electromagnetic fields, which is so important now with 5G and 4G and Wi-Fi, and everything that has a battery emits a wavelength, a frequency that can disrupt our DNA that we have to pay attention to. But the big point of this whole talk is find your causes. Because if you find your causes, it's a really simple two-step process when you think about it. You find your causes, and then you just match up the solution with those causes.
So simple, so eloquent, and so thorough. Can you share with everyone where they can get your book, how they can follow you, all the social media stuff? We're going to put all the notes, but please be shameless in your pitch and promotion of this, because I know there are people listening to this right now that are at their rope's end, and they want to find a solution, and you have many of those answers.
Thank you. So the place to start really is at our website, fixyourfatigue.com, FIXYOUR, FATIGUE.com. And really the next step is to get on a free call with us, so that you can see if you're a good fit for our program. And you can take the quiz that's on our website. You know, all roads essentially lead to that free call. So, you know, it's worth your time. And we get on the call with everybody. So, you know, don't even worry about, you know, whatever you can afford or whatnot. We just want to make sure that we're serving everybody. So, you know, take action, whether it's with me, whether it's with somebody else. Find your causes, take action, one step at a time. You know, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. You have to stay in action. And the question that you should be asking yourself every single day is, what can I do today to resolve my fatigue? What can I do today to move my health forward?
Dr. Evan Hirsch, the author of Fix Your Fatigue. He's laid out a great game plan, and thank you for putting forth such a beautiful offer. They can call you, they can take a quiz, they can meet with someone that can provide them a roadmap of how they can get out of a debilitating situation. You are a saint, and you're doing good work in the world. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule today to join us on the Awesome Health Podcast. For all our listeners out there, I hope you enjoyed this brief examination of what could be causing fatigue. If you know somebody who has fatigue, who struggled with fatigue, a family member, a friend, I encourage you to listen to this podcast, talk to Dr. Hirsch and his team, and get the solutions that you need. There are answers, and that's what this podcast is all about. This is the Awesome Health Podcast from Bioptimizers. I'm Wei-T Lightheart, signing off for another day. Have yourself the healthiest day ever, and we'll see you on the next episode.
At Bioptimizers, our mission is to fix digestion, and a cornerstone of digestion is gut flora. P3OM is our patented probiotic formula. In fact, we call it the Navy SEALs of probiotics. You see, strong proteolytic or protein digesting activity is paramount to having a healthy gut flora. And of course, P3OM provides that. The good news is, unlike weaker probiotics, P3OM survives the digestion process. What it does is it basically multiplies the good guys while protecting you against pathogens, or what some people call the bad guys. P3OM really helps to rebuild your digestion. And what that allows you to do is to maximize nutrient uptake, energy, and metabolism. To find out more of how P3OM can help you, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.